There is a rule inside organized crime that has existed longer than any law or task force designed to stop it. The rule is simple. If someone is going to talk, they do not get to talk. Not a warning, not a message. The witness dies. And if killing the witness is not enough, if the testimony is already running, if the trial has already started, then you kill the judge, the prosecutor, the sons of the man who cooperated. You poison the one sitting in his hospital bed. You throw the canary out the window and arrange the bed sheets so it looks like he tried to fly. The 10 cases in this video span more than 5 decades and 3 countries. They cover a national wire service owner poisoned through his IV line, a 29-year-old businessman murdered in front of his 4-year-old son, a former Mafia boss shot the night before a Senate hearing, and judges blown apart by half a ton of explosives buried under a highway. What connects all of them is not the method, it is the logic. The mob could not afford these people to speak, so they made sure they never did. Case 1. Abe Reles, the canary who could sing but couldn't fly. In the early morning of November 12, 1941, a man's body was found lying on a low roof extension on the 2nd floor of the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, Brooklyn. He had fallen from room 623, 6 floors above. His name was Abraham Reles, and by the time the sun came up, the most important criminal witness in American history was dead. A few hours before he was supposed to walk into a courtroom and put one of the most feared men in organized crime in front of a jury. Abe Reles was born in 1906 in the Brownsville neighborhood of Brooklyn to Jewish immigrant parents. His father sold knishes from a pushcart. Reles went to reform school at 13. By his early 20s, he had graduated to running a slot machine operation for the Shapiro brothers, who controlled the Brooklyn rackets. When the Shapiros tried to have him killed, Reles aligned with a group of Jewish and Italian killers from Brownsville and Ocean Hill and systematically wiped out the entire Shapiro family, one by one. Meyer Shapiro was buried alive under Canarsie Beach. The others followed. Reles and his crew then absorbed everything the Shapiros had controlled. By the mid-1930s, Reles and his crew had become the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate, the killing machine that kept the entire organized crime structure of New York running. It became known as Murder, Inc. The bosses who sat above it were Louis Lepke Buchalter and Albert Anastasia. Reles personally killed at least 11 people. He may have killed as many as 30. His weapon of choice was an ice pick, which he would drive through his victim's ear directly into the brain. Victims who were later examined by doctors were initially thought to have died of cerebral hemorrhages. Their wounds were that clean. The syndicate was eventually estimated to have carried out somewhere between 400 and 1,000 contract killings across its decade of operation. What ended it was Reles himself. In 1940, Reles was arrested on a homicide charge. Facing the electric chair, he made a decision that nobody in the history of the American Mafia had made before him. He agreed to talk. He sat down with Brooklyn District Attorney William O'Dwyer and his assistant Burton Turkis and gave them everything. Turkis later described Reles as having a photographic memory. He gave testimony that was precise, detailed, and devastating. He could name the killers, explain the method, describe the motive, and in many cases, lead investigators to the bodies. In total, his information helped solve 85 murders. He provided the evidence that put 6 Murder, Inc. killers in the electric chair, including his own former partners Harry Strauss, Martin Goldstein, Harry Maione, Frank Abendando, Mendy Weiss, and Louis Capone. He gave testimony in 3 major trials. Brooklyn D.A. O'Dwyer even flew him to California to testify before a grand jury about the activities of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. The biggest name left was Albert Anastasia. Anastasia was the co-chief of Murder, Inc. operations, the man who received the kill orders from Buchalter and made sure they were carried out. He had been charged with murder multiple times throughout his life, And every single time, the charges had dissolved. In 1932, he was indicted for murder, and the case was dropped for lack of witnesses. In 1928, he had been charged with a Brooklyn killing, and the witnesses either disappeared or refused to testify. He was a man the law could never touch, because everyone who could put him away had a habit of ending up unavailable. Relis could change that. He had direct knowledge linking Anastasia to the murder of Morris Diamond, a partner of Buchalter's in the flour trucking rackets. With Relis on the stand, prosecutors believed they finally had a case that could send Anastasia to Sing Sing's death chamber. The trial was set for November 12, 1941. Because of who Relis was and who he was testifying against, D.A. O'Dwyer's office made arrangements that were supposed to be airtight. They rented a wing on the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel, a 14-story hotel on the Coney Island Boardwalk at West 29th Street. The wing had a heavy steel door. 18 police officers were assigned to guard the witnesses inside, working around the clock in shifts. Relis and 3 other cooperating witnesses, Albert Tannenbaum, Mickey Sykoff, and Sholem Bernstein, were each given their own room. Journalists called it the Rat's Suite. Relis had been living there for most of a year by the time November 1941 arrived. He had testified in court multiple times during that period, escorted to and from proceedings under police protection. He had shown no desire to escape. In fact, investigators noted that Relis was afraid to be out of earshot of the police, not wanting to be left alone for any length of time. On the night of November 11, 1941, the guards on Relis's floor went to sleep. Sometime between 3 a.m. and 6:30 a.m. on November 12th, Relis went through the window of room 623. His body was found on the second-floor roof extension below, not on the ground directly beneath the window, but 20 feet out from the base of the building. 2 bed sheets were found partially wound around him, along with a length of wire. Up in room 623, investigators found more wire tied to a radiator valve leading out the window, where the knot had come undone. The official explanation was that Relis had tied the sheets and wire together to lower himself to the 5th-floor window below, trying to escape, or perhaps play a prank on his guards, and the homemade rope failed and he fell. There were problems with this almost immediately. The first was the distance. Forensic experts noted that his body landed too far from the wall to have simply fallen from a rope hanging directly beneath his window. If the rope had snapped while he was descending, he should have landed close to the building. He was found 20 feet out. The second problem was the knots. Relis was a professional killer who had used ropes, wires, and ligatures in murders throughout his career. The knots on his makeshift rope were described as loose and amateurish, the kind of work that would not be expected from a man with his background. The third problem was the guards. All 6 officers assigned to the floor that night claimed they had been asleep. 18 men, with the most important witness in the country behind a steel door, and every single one of them was asleep? 5 of the officers were demoted the following day. Lucky Luciano, speaking years later from exile, said that the police had been paid $50,000 to do it. He claimed that the guards knocked Relis unconscious with a police nightstick and threw him out the window, then arranged the sheets to make it look like an escape attempt. Joseph Valachi, the Genovese family soldier who became the first made member of the American Mafia to testify publicly about its existence, also stated that Relis had been murdered by his guards. Assistant DA Burton Turkis, the man who had prosecuted Murder Inc. and worked alongside Relis for months, was direct. Relis was thrown out of that window. The DA's statement the next day was bleak. The case against Anastasia, he said, went out the window with Relis. Albert Anastasia was never charged. The charges were dropped. Anastasia went on to become the boss of what is now the Gambino crime family. He continued to order murders throughout the 1940s and 1950s. In 1952, he watched a television news report in which a man named Arnold Schuster, who had no connection to the Mafia whatsoever, was being interviewed about helping the FBI locate bank robber Willie Sutton. Anastasia turned to an associate and ordered the man killed. Schuster was shot dead the following month on a Brooklyn street. Anastasia was never charged. He was finally killed in October 1957, shot in the barber's chair of the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan by two masked gunmen, in what is now one of the most famous mob hits in American history. A grand jury investigation into Rellis's death was completed in 1951, 10 years after his body was found on that roof. The jury concluded that Rellis had died accidentally while trying to escape. Nobody was ever charged. The murder of Abe Rellis, if it was murder, remains officially unsolved. The steel door, the 18 guards, the 20-foot landing distance, the loose knots, and the $50,000 bribe that Lucky Luciano described are all that exist as answers, and none of them are answers at all. Anastasia walked free because a man went out a window at 3 o'clock in the morning with police guarding his door. That is the only thing that is certain about what happened at the Half Moon Hotel on November 12, 1941. The next case on this list involves a man who was not a mobster turned witness, but a Chicago cop turned crime reporter who had spent decades exposing the outfit and who was shot dead in his own garage at 6:45 in the evening, with the phone message granting him police protection sitting unread on his desk upstairs. Case 2. William Drury. I'm awfully hot. William Drury joined the Chicago Police Department in 1924 at age 22. He was Irish, stocky, and known for two things: being completely fearless around mob figures and never leaving home without a hat. He had a thing about hats. He was known to say he would rather be caught dead than without one. It was almost a joke among people who knew him. In the late 1920s and through the 1930s, Drury worked as a plainclothesman while the Chicago Outfit, the successor organization to Al Capone's empire, ran gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, and labor rackets across the city. Drury became known as one of the few officers in Chicago who could not be bought. He arrested mob figures when he could, pushed corruption cases when others looked away, and drew the direct attention of outfit leadership as a result. Word reportedly came down from Capone's circle to the department's upper ranks to reassign him to pickpocket patrol and keep him away from organized crime investigations. He stayed. His career began falling apart in 1944 when he was suspended for failing to suppress citywide gambling. The outfit had significant reach inside the department and the city's political structure. In 1947, Drury and his partner refused to testify before a grand jury investigating a murder case they had been working on. 2 of the 3 witnesses they had found had recanted, claiming their identifications of suspects had been coerced. Then one of those recanting witnesses turned up dead. With the case collapsing around them and their credibility destroyed, Drury and his partner were fired from the force. They appealed the decision through every court available to them, city, state, then the U.S. Supreme Court. They lost at every level. Drury always maintained that the outfit had engineered his firing. He named Jake Guzik, one of the outfit's key financial operators, and a man he had personally arrested years earlier, as the man who orchestrated it. After losing his career, Drury opened a private detective agency out of the second floor of his home at 1843 West Addison Street and began writing articles for the Chicago Herald-American and later the Miami Daily News, laying out what he knew about the Chicago Syndicate and how it had spread its operations into Florida. He placed ads in Chicago newspapers offering his services to any group that wanted to take on the mob. He was not hiding from anyone. In 1950, Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee established a special Senate committee to investigate organized crime across the United States. The committee traveled to major cities, holding hearings that were broadcast live on television.
something almost nobody had seen before with a congressional investigation. Millions of Americans watched. The Kefauver Committee was coming to Chicago,
And when it did, it planned to look hard at the outfit's operations and its connections to local politicians, police, and judges. Drury had already been providing information to investigators informally. He was one of the most knowledgeable people in the country on the internal workings of the Chicago outfit, and he had nothing left to lose professionally. By September 1950, preparations were being made for his formal testimony before the committee when it arrived in Chicago. On September 25, 1950, Drury went to see his attorney. He was agitated. He told the lawyer he was awfully hot, meaning he felt the danger around him had become immediate, and that he needed protection before he could appear before the committee. His attorney called a Kefauver Committee investigator to relay the request. The investigator said he needed to check with his superiors and asked that Drury call him back at 7 p.m. That afternoon, Drury's wife Annabelle received a phone call at the house. A Kefauver Committee investigator was calling to confirm that her husband's request for protection had been approved. The message was left for him. He was not home yet. At 6:45 p.m., Drury pulled his black Cadillac into the alley behind the house and backed it into the garage. Two men were waiting in the darkness. One had a shotgun. One had a .45 caliber automatic pistol. They put 4 rounds through the windshield. The first shots knocked the hat from Drury's head. The rest tore into his head and body. He died within the hour. He was 48 years old. Annabelle heard what she thought was a car backfiring from inside the house. At 7:35 p.m., worried that her husband had not come inside, she went to the garage window and shone a light through. Then she ran to a nearby grocery store. Upstairs in the house, on Drury's desk, was the phone message. Protection approved. Please call. 4 hours later, and about 2 miles away, a lawyer named Marvin Bass was shot dead by 2 gunmen near the elevated train tracks. Bass had been collecting information on Chicago's gambling operations and had been in contact with Drury in the days before the murder. Both men were killed on the same night, within hours of each other, before the Kefauver Committee arrived in Chicago. An anonymous letter arrived at Senator Kefauver's office on October 2, 1950. Kefauver read it 3 days later into the official congressional record during the opening of the Chicago hearings to ensure it became part of the permanent record. The letter named outfit bosses Jake Guzik and Charles Fischetti as having ordered the Drury killing, with the hit itself carried out by a group of North Side triggermen. The Chicago outfit's Paul Rica and Louis Campagna were held for questioning. There was not enough evidence to charge them. Nobody was ever charged in either killing. The Drury and Bass murders remain officially unsolved. Senator Kefauver told the Chicago Tribune that the killing showed the savagery of the Chicago gang and that the killers must be brought to justice. They never were. The committee went ahead with its Chicago hearings without Drury. Tony Accardo, the outfit's boss, appeared before the committee and invoked the Fifth Amendment 140 times. Jake Guzik, the man Drury had named as the architect of his firing, also appeared and said nothing of value. The men Drury had spent his career trying to expose sat in front of a Senate committee, said nothing, and walked out. One of the few people who could have told that committee what they actually needed to know had been shot to death in his garage the night before the hearings began. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case involves a man who was not a cop or a reporter, but a Chicago businessman. A 29-year-old with a wife, a small son, and a plastics company in the suburbs, who agreed to become the government's star witness against the Chicago outfit's most colorful boss, and paid for that decision in front of his own family on a September morning in 1974. Case 3. Daniel Seifert, the only man who could link Lombardo. Danny Seifert was a high school dropout from Chicago who figured out early that he was good with his hands and better at business than most people around him. By his late 20s, he had built 2 companies from nothing. The first was International Fiberglass in Elk Grove Village. The second was a plastics firm called Plastic-Matic Products in the suburb of Bensonville. He had a wife named Emma, 3 children, Nick, Kathy, and 4-year-old Joe, and a townhouse in the suburbs. He was 29 years old in 1974 and had no reason to expect that year would be his last. The problem was who he had gone into business with. In the early 1970s, Seifert's fiberglass company became connected to Joseph Lombardo, a senior figure in the Chicago outfit who ran the Grand Avenue crew on the city's west side. Lombardo was known on the street as Joey the Clown, not because he was harmless, but because of the act he put on. He covered his face with newspapers when photographers were around. He made courtroom jokes. He projected the image of a neighborhood eccentric. The FBI and the outfit's rivals knew him differently. According to court records and the Chicago Crime Commission, Lombardo had been inducted into the outfit as a made member after allegedly carrying out a murder in 1965. He was eventually put in charge of the outfit's robbery and Las Vegas rackets.
The clown persona was exactly that, a persona. Lombardo and associates, including Irwin Weiner, Anthony Spilatro, and Teamsters financial consultant Alan Dorfman, had been using the Central States Pension Fund of the Teamsters Union as their personal bank. The pension fund was enormous. It held the retirement savings of hundreds of thousands of union workers, and the outfit had spent years directing fraudulent loans from it to mob-connected businesses, including casinos in Las Vegas. Seifert's companies were among the businesses used to receive and cycle the money. In February 1974, a federal grand jury indicted Lombardo, Dorfman, Spilatro, Weiner, and others on charges of defrauding the Teamsters pension fund of $1.4 million. It was a complicated financial case. Proving it to a jury required someone who had been inside the operation and could explain how the money moved. Seifert was that person. He had been approached by FBI agents and agreed to cooperate. He was going to be the government's star witness, the only person who could directly connect Lombardo to the fraud. Without him, the case had no center. Word got out. In the mob, word always gets out. Lombardo began appearing outside the Seifert family home, just sitting in a parked car. Seifert's son, Nick, then 12, once rode his bicycle up to the car, said hello to the man he knew as Uncle Joe, and told him his dad would be out in a minute. Lombardo said he would wait. Seifert saw what his son had done and immediately called the children inside. He began keeping guns hidden around the house and around the office. He was not going to be chased away. The trial was only a few weeks off. On the morning of September 27, 1974, Danny and Emma Seifert loaded 4-year-old Joe into the station wagon. The older 2 children were at school, and drove to the Plastic-Matic factory. It was a Friday. The morning was clear. Emma started making coffee in the small kitchen, while Danny went back outside to get a vacuum cleaner from the car. A hit team of 4 masked men moved in. 2 of them came through the back door of the office, burst in on Emma and Joe, and put guns in their faces. One of the men told Emma it was a robbery and they did not want to hurt her. They shoved her and the 4-year-old into the bathroom and held them there. Outside, the other men were dealing with Danny. He fought back. He was beaten and shot with a .38 caliber revolver inside the factory. Despite being wounded, he ran. He got out of the building and ran across the parking lot, shouting for someone to call the police. A gunman positioned behind a parked car cut him off. 3 shotgun blasts at close range brought him down in the grass outside the building. One of the shots was to the head. From inside the locked bathroom, Emma could hear it happening. When it was over and the men were gone, she came out. Her 4-year-old son had seen the blood on the office wall. He would describe the moment years later by saying everything went black and white until he saw his father lying in the grass outside, and then the color came back. The trees were brown.
The grass was green, and the blood was red. That is what a 4-year-old remembers from the morning his father was murdered. When the Bensonville police asked Emma that day if she knew who was behind it, she said she was not sure. She was afraid. She had young children still at home and no way to protect them. But that same day, she told Danny's brother Ronald the name she believed was responsible, and Ronald testified to it years later. She had recognized one of the masked men by his build and the way he moved. Light on his feet, like a boxer, solid and short. The man she described was Joey Lombardo. Her youngest son had been named after him. With Seifert dead, every charge against Lombardo in the pension fund case was dropped for lack of evidence. Dorfman and the others were acquitted. The federal case collapsed entirely. Lombardo went on to oversee the outfit's skimming operations in Las Vegas for years afterward. He was eventually convicted of separate charges in 1982 and served time. But when he got out in 1992, he took out a classified ad in the Chicago Tribune proclaiming his innocence of any mob affiliation and asking neighbors to call his parole officer if they saw him break any laws. The Seifert murder went unsolved for 33 years. It was only in 2003 when FBI investigators reopened the case as part of Operation Family Secrets, a sweeping prosecution of the Chicago outfit built around the testimony of former hitman Nick Calabrese, that Lombardo was formally charged with Danny Seifert's murder. At the 2007 Family Secrets trial, Emma Seifert testified about what she saw that morning. Her son Joe, now a grown man, sat in the courtroom gallery and listened to his mother describe the day he was 4 years old and locked in a bathroom while his father was chased down and killed. On September 27, 2007, exactly 33 years to the day after the murder, the jury convicted Lombardo of Daniel Seifert's killing. On February 2, 2009, U.S. District Judge James Zagel sentenced Lombardo to life in prison. At sentencing, Joe Seifert stood in federal court and told Lombardo directly that he did not hate him, did not know him, and would never forgive him. Lombardo insisted until the end that he was innocent. He died in federal Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, on October 19, 2019. He was 90 years old. Danny Seifert was 29 when he was killed. His son Joe was 4. The federal pension fraud case that Seifert had agreed to expose, $1.4 million stolen from the retirement savings of ordinary union workers, was never prosecuted because the man who could prove it happened was shot dead in the grass outside his own factory. The next case moves from a Chicago suburb in 1974 to a Chicago suburb in 1975, where the former boss of the entire outfit was cooking a late-night meal for a guest who had been let in through an unlocked basement door the night before he was scheduled to testify before a United States Senate committee. Case 4. Sam Giancana, the bullet in the mouth. Sam Giancana grew up in a neighborhood on Chicago's west side called The Patch, the son of Sicilian immigrants. His father sold produce from a pushcart. By his early teens, Giancana was running with a street gang called the 42 Gang, which operated as a feeder crew for the Chicago Outfit, the successor organization to Al Capone's criminal empire. Police believed he was responsible for at least 3 murders before he was 20, though he was never tried for any of them. He was arrested more than 70 times across his life for various offenses. By the late 1930s, he had graduated fully into the outfit, and by 1957, Tony Accardo, the outfit's longtime boss, stepped back from daily operations and put Giancana in charge as the public-facing boss. Giancana ran the outfit from 1957 to 1966. During that time, the organization controlled gambling, loan sharking, prostitution, and labor rackets across Chicago, and extended its reach into Las Vegas casinos, Cuban gambling operations before Castro's revolution, and political circles at the highest level of American government. Giancana had police chiefs on his payroll. He had connections inside City Hall. Some sources, including declassified FBI files, allege he helped deliver Chicago's vote to John F. Kennedy in the 1960 presidential election. Whether that is fully accurate or not, the CIA considered Giancana useful enough to recruit him in September 1960 for a secret program to assassinate Cuban leader Fidel Castro. Castro had driven the mob out of Cuba after his 1959 revolution, costing Giancana and other mob bosses tens of millions in gambling revenue. The CIA, through an intermediary, approached Giancana via Chicago outfit associate Johnny Rosselli and recruited them both. The plan involved poison pills intended for Castro's food. It never worked. The assassination attempts failed repeatedly and were eventually abandoned. Giancana's visibility became a problem for the outfit. He appeared in newspapers too often, associated too publicly with celebrities like Frank Sinatra, and drew constant federal attention. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, had made dismantling organized crime a priority, and Giancana was a primary target. In 1965, Giancana was jailed for contempt of court after refusing to testify before a grand jury investigating mob activities. He served a year. When he got out in 1966, the outfit's senior figures had seen enough of the publicity. He was removed from his leadership position. He fled to Cuernavaca, Mexico, where he ran gambling operations and stayed out of reach of U.S. courts for years. The Mexican government deported him in July 1974, and he returned to Chicago, moving back into his home at 1147 South Winona Avenue in Oak Park, a quiet suburb west of the city. By early 1975, the political fallout from Watergate and reports of illegal CIA domestic surveillance had created enormous pressure in Congress to investigate the intelligence agencies. In January 1975, the Senate established what became known as the Church Committee, formerly the Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities, chaired by Senator Frank Church of Idaho. Among its investigations was the CIA's use of organized crime figures in assassination plots against foreign leaders, specifically Castro. Giancana was subpoenaed. So was Johnny Rosselli. Giancana flew to Houston in the weeks before his scheduled appearance. He became ill and underwent gallbladder surgery. He recovered and returned to Oak Park on June 17, 1975. Senate Intelligence Committee staffers arrived in Chicago on June 19, 1975, planning to escort him to Washington the next morning for his testimony. They were aware he had little enthusiasm for sitting before a congressional committee. That evening, Giancana had family and friends over at the Oak Park house. His youngest daughter, Francine, visited with her husband and their daughter. Two longtime outfit associates, Chucky English and Dominic Butch Blasi, were also there. Blasi had been Giancana's driver and close confidant for years. All of the guests left around 11 p.m. Chicago police detectives had been sitting in an unmarked car outside the house, watching who came and went, but they had already left for the night. The basement door to the house was unlocked. Giancana went to the basement kitchen and began cooking sausage and peppers. His caretaker, Joseph DiPersio, was upstairs. Someone entered through the basement door. Someone Giancana knew and trusted, because there was no sign of struggle or forced entry, and because Giancana could not eat spicy food due to his heart condition, meaning he was almost certainly cooking for his guest, not for himself. He was shot once in the back of the head with a .22 caliber pistol fitted with a silencer. He fell. The shooter then rolled him over and fired 6 more times, placing the shots in a circle around his mouth and into his neck and chin. DiPersio came downstairs at around 11 p.m. and found him on the floor in a pool of blood. The money clip in Giancana's pocket had more than $1,400 in it. Nothing was taken. The placement of the final 6 shots was not random. In traditional Mafia execution symbolism, a bullet in the throat signals that the victim talked too much. A bullet in the mouth signals he will never talk again. The shooter put multiple rounds in both locations. It was a message directed at anyone else who might be considering what Giancana was about to do. New York Times columnist William Safire described Giancana as the only person in American history murdered just before he was to appear in front of a congressional committee. The Church Committee's investigation into the CIA Castro plots continued without him. His associate Rosselli did testify in June and September of 1975. The following year, the committee recalled Rosselli for further testimony about whether those CIA Mafia assassination plots had any connection to the Kennedy assassination. In July 1976, Rosselli disappeared from his sister's home in Florida. His body was found on August 7, 1976, stuffed into a 55-gallon steel drum floating in Dumfoundling Bay near Miami. He had been strangled. His legs had been sawed off to fit him inside the drum. The drum had been punched full of holes and wrapped in chains to keep it submerged. The chains had failed. Nobody was ever charged with Giancana's murder. Blasi, the last person to see him alive, and the man who investigators long considered the most likely suspect, was never charged. Giancana's daughter Antoinette publicly stated that the Senate subpoena requiring her father to appear was his death warrant.
The murder has remained officially unsolved for 50 years. The gun used to kill Giancana, a .22 caliber high-standard automatic pistol with a homemade silencer and 42 holes drilled in the barrel to make it quieter, was found by river forest maintenance workers on August 19, 1975, in wooded forest preserve property about 2 miles from the house. What Giancana knew about the CIA, the Castro plots, and what else the outfit had done in those years died with him on the basement floor in Oak Park. What Rosselli knew died with him in a steel drum off Miami. The committee got neither man's full story. Case 5. Johnny Rosselli, the man in the drum. Johnny Rosselli was born Filippo Sacco in Esperia, a small town in Lazio, Italy, on July 4, 1905. He immigrated to the United States with his mother in 1911, settling in Somerville, Massachusetts, near Boston. His father died in 1918. In 1922, after a narcotics arrest in Massachusetts, Sacco fled to Chicago and changed his name to John Rosselli, reportedly in honor of Italian Renaissance sculptor Cosimo Rosselli. He was 17 years old. Within a few years, he had aligned with the Chicago outfit under Al Capone and was given a role in the organization's operations in Los Angeles, serving as Capone's representative on the West Coast. Over the following decades, Rosselli became one of the most useful and connected figures in American organized crime. In the 1930s and 1940s, he and the outfit extorted the Hollywood film studios by threatening labor stoppages through their control of union officials. He was convicted in 1943 of those extortion charges alongside senior outfit figures, including Paul Ricca, and served time in federal prison before being paroled in 1947. After his release, he moved back into Hollywood, produced several low-budget crime films, and by the mid-1950s shifted his primary focus to Las Vegas. By 1956, Rosselli had become the Chicago outfit and the Los Angeles mob's chief representative in Las Vegas, the man responsible for ensuring that the casinos delivered their skimmed profits back to the bosses in Chicago. He was one of the most polished operators in the mob's history, well-dressed, well-spoken, and comfortable in rooms that most mobsters never entered. In September 1960, the CIA came to him. After Fidel Castro's revolution in Cuba in January 1959, the mob lost its casino operations in Havana overnight. Rosselli, Giancana, and Tampa boss Santo Trafficante had all lost significant money and influence. The CIA, looking for people motivated to see Castro dead, approached former FBI agent Robert Mayhew,
who contacted Rosselli under the pretense of representing business interests that wanted Castro eliminated. Mayhew offered $150,000 for the job. Rosselli refused payment.
He introduced Mayhew to Giancana and Trafficante, and the CIA provided 6 poison pills to be placed in Castro's food. The attempts failed. A second round of attempts involving poison and sniper teams also failed. The plots were eventually abandoned, but the relationship between Rosselli and the CIA had been established and was now documented. For years, this remained a secret. Then the political environment shifted entirely. The Watergate scandal in 1972 and 1973, and subsequent investigations into illegal CIA domestic surveillance, pushed Congress to scrutinize the intelligence agencies in ways that had never happened before. In January 1975, the Senate established the Church Committee, tasked with investigating abuses by American intelligence agencies, including the Castro assassination plots. Both Giancana and Rosselli were subpoenaed. 5 days before Rosselli's first scheduled testimony, Giancana was shot 7 times in his Oak Park basement. The committee went ahead without Giancana. Rosselli testified on June 24 and September 22, 1975, telling the senators about Operation Mongoose, the CIA's Cuba assassination program, and his own role in it. What Rosselli said in those sessions was more than anyone in the CIA or the outfit had expected him to say in public. He described recruitment by the agency, the poison pills, the failed attempts, and the relationship between the mob and American intelligence that had existed for years. He implied that the same networks built to kill Castro may have been involved in events in Dallas on November 22, 1963, that the CIA's hit team assembled for Cuba had been turned and used against Kennedy. He did not state this as fact, and the committee treated it as unverifiable, but it was on the record. On April 23, 1976, Rosselli was called back before the committee to testify specifically on the question of whether there had been a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. He appeared and testified again. The committee then decided it needed to recall him a third time for follow-up questions. They expected to schedule him within a few months. On July 28, 1976, Rosselli borrowed his sister's car from her home in Plantation, Florida, and said he was going to play golf. He never arrived at the course. His sister reported him missing on July 28th. His car was found at Miami International Airport, golf clubs still in the trunk, a smudged window. The car had been left there to suggest he had taken a flight somewhere, the classic mob tactic for buying time before a body surfaces. On August 3rd, Senator Howard Baker, a member of the committee, requested that the FBI investigate Rosselli's disappearance. On August 7, 1976, 10 days after he had vanished, a fisherman in Dumbfoundling Bay near Miami found a 55-gallon steel oil drum floating on the surface. The drum had been punched full of holes and wrapped in heavy chains, designed to keep it on the bottom permanently.
The gases from decomposition had pushed it up anyway. Inside was the body of Johnny Rosselli. He had been strangled. His legs had been sawed off and folded into the drum alongside the rest of him to make him fit. He was 71 years old. Forensic examination confirmed he had died of asphyxiation. The FBI, at the direction of Attorney General Edward Levi, and at the request of Senate committee members, investigated whether his testimony had led to his murder. Federal investigators ultimately concluded that Rosselli was killed by Frank Schweiz, Vincent Insero, and 2 other men, and that the contract had been sanctioned by Chicago outfit consigliere Tony Accardo on the grounds that Rosselli had become a public embarrassment to the organization. Time magazine ran a full page on his death under the headline, "Deep Six for Johnny."
It noted that the decomposing gases had foiled the killer's plan to keep him on the bottom, and that Rosselli was one of a breed that was dying off, usually by murder. His murder was never prosecuted. The Church Committee completed its work without him. Santo Trafficante, the only surviving member of the original CIA Mafia trio recruited to kill Castro, testified before the committee, but was evasive. He died of natural causes in 1987. Sam Giancana, killed the night before his testimony. Johnny Rosselli, killed between his second and third rounds of testimony. Both men who had stood at the intersection of the CIA and the Mafia and been asked to speak about it publicly were dead. The only one who could still say what they had both known was Trafficante, and he said almost nothing. The committee got no usable testimony about the Kennedy assassination from either man. What both murders accomplished above everything else was silence. The next case moves the story to New York in December 1978, where a mob crew walked out of JFK Airport with nearly $6 million in cash and jewelry, and where the man who planned the robbery then spent the following year systematically killing every single person who had been involved, one by one, to make sure none of them could ever testify against him. Case 6. Parnell Edwards and the Lufthansa Witness Trail. At 3 o'clock in the morning on December 11, 1978, a black Ford Econoline van pulled up to the gate of Lufthansa's cargo terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens, New York. 6 men in ski masks cut the padlock with bolt cutters and went inside. They handcuffed 9 Lufthansa employees and locked them in the lunchroom. A cargo supervisor was forced at gunpoint to open the double-door vault. Inside were 72 15-pound boxes of untraceable American currency, dollars that had been exchanged overseas by U.S. military personnel and tourists in West Germany, flown back to New York, and sitting in the vault over the weekend, waiting to be collected by an armored truck on Monday morning. At 4:21 a.m., 64 minutes after the van arrived, the crew drove away. They transferred everything to the trunks of 2 cars at an auto repair shop in Canarsie, Brooklyn, and split up. The haul came to $5 million in cash and $875,000 in jewelry. It was, at the time, the largest cash robbery in American history. The man behind it was James Burke, known on the street as Jimmy the Gent. Burke was born James Conway in New York on July 5, 1931, and was Irish-American, which meant he could never be formally inducted into the Italian-American Mafia as a made man. He was raised in foster homes and a Catholic orphanage, moved through several abusive placements, and by his teens was already committing crimes for organized crime figures in Queens. He became an associate of Paul Vario, a capo in the Lucchese crime family, and built his own crew of thieves, loan sharks, and killers who operated out of a bar he owned in South Ozone Park, Queens, called Robert's Lounge. Henry Hill, who later became a government informant and whose story formed the basis for the film Goodfellas, was one of Burke's closest associates. The FBI believed Burke was personally involved in at least 50 murders over his career. The tip for the Lufthansa job came from a Lufthansa cargo worker named Louis Werner, who owed $20,000 in gambling debts to his bookie, Martin Krugman. Werner knew that currency shipments from West Germany regularly passed through the cargo terminal and sometimes sat in the vault over a weekend. He told Krugman. Krugman told Henry Hill. Hill brought it to Burke. Vario, the Lucchese capo, approved the operation. Burke assembled his crew, gathered floor plans and employee schedules from Werner, and waited for the right shipment. On December 9, 1978, Werner sent word that a large shipment had arrived and would be in the vault until Monday. Burke set the job for the early hours of December 11th. One member of the crew was not inside the cargo building. Parnell Edwards, known as Stax, was assigned the single task that needed to happen after the robbery: drive the getaway van to a junkyard in New Jersey and have it compacted and destroyed. The van had fingerprints, ski masks, a leather jacket, and a footprint from a Puma sneaker inside it. Getting rid of it was not optional. Edwards drove to his girlfriend's apartment instead. He drank and used cocaine,
and fell asleep. The van sat parked at a fire hydrant 2 days after one of the largest robberies in American history, in a no-parking zone in Canarsie, Brooklyn. A patrol officer spotted it on December 13th, ran the plates, and called it in. Police impounded the van and found fingerprints that led them directly to Edwards and then to Burke's crew. Within 3 days of the robbery, the FBI had identified Burke as the mastermind. Burke was already paranoid. When he found out about the van, he made a decision that would define the next 7 months. Rather than give the participants their promised shares, cuts of between $10,000 and $50,000 each, and hope they stayed quiet, Burke concluded it was simpler to kill everyone who could connect him to the robbery. Henry Hill later said Burke told associates, "Rather than give everyone $400,000 or $500,000 apiece, it was easier to put a quarter bullet in their head." Parnell Edwards was first. On December 18, 1978, 1 week after the robbery, Tommy DeSimone and Angelo Sepe went to his apartment in South Ozone Park and shot him 5 times in the head with a .25 caliber revolver. He was found with a piece of chicken still in his mouth. On January 6, 1979, Martin Krugman disappeared. Krugman had been loudly demanding his share of the money. According to Hill, Burke had him killed at a mob-connected fence company on Rockaway Boulevard in Queens. His body was never found. He was believed to have been dismembered. On January 14, 1979, Tommy DeSimone himself disappeared. DeSimone had murdered 2 members of the Gambino family without permission, which was a death sentence, regardless of the Lufthansa situation. He was lured to what he believed was his formal induction ceremony as a made member of the Lucchese family, and was killed instead. His body was never recovered. In late January 1979, Richard Eaton, a con man who had defrauded Burke out of $250,000 in a drug deal, was found bound and gagged and strangled in a refrigerated trailer in Brooklyn. A phone book with Burke's number was found on the body. This murder would eventually become the one that put Burke in prison for life. In March 1979, Louis Kafora and his wife Joanna vanished. Kafora had been one of the stick-up men inside the cargo terminal. After the robbery, Burke told everyone to keep quiet and make no big purchases. Kafora bought his wife a custom pink Cadillac and drove it near the JFK cargo area where the FBI was actively investigating. According to Hill, Kafora had also attempted to become an FBI informant. Both husband and wife were killed and compacted with their car at an auto wreck yard. Their bodies were never found. In May 1979, Joe Manry and Robert McMahon, both cargo thieves who had been inside the terminal during the robbery, were found shot in the back of the head, execution style, sitting together in a parked car. In June 1979, the burned, naked, and bullet-riddled body of Paolo Licastri was found on a smoldering trash heap in Brooklyn. Licastri had been the Gambino family's representative on the job, overseeing their cut of the proceeds. By the summer of 1979, 9 people directly connected to the Lufthansa robbery were dead or missing. The FBI had extensive surveillance on Burke, but nothing that would hold up in court. Ski masks found under the getaway van were traced to witnesses who had already been killed. The inside man, Werner, was the only person ever convicted, sentenced to 15 years in 1979, because he refused to cooperate and had no first-hand knowledge of the crew's identities beyond Burke, and even that was too indirect to prosecute. Burke was never charged with the heist. He was eventually convicted in 1982, based on Henry Hill's testimony, of conspiracy charges related to a Boston College basketball point-shaving scheme, a separate crime. While serving that sentence, he was convicted of the murder of Richard Eaton and given a further 20 years to life. He died of lung cancer on April 13, 1996, in a state facility in Buffalo, New York. He was 64 years old. He never spent a single day in prison for the Lufthansa robbery. The cash and jewelry were never recovered. Not a dollar of the $5.875 million has ever been officially found. Every person who could have testified against Burke in court for the Lufthansa heist was dead before any trial could begin. That was the entire point. Burke understood what the mob had always understood, that without witnesses, there is no case. He applied that principle with complete thoroughness. It worked. The only man left alive who knew what Burke had done was Henry Hill, and Hill only survived by becoming a government witness and disappearing into federal witness protection in 1980 with his family. He was expelled from the program in 1987 after more drug arrests and died in 2012 at age 69.
None of his former associates attended his funeral.
The next case takes us from the streets of New York to the motorway outside Palermo, Sicily, where on May 23, 1992, half a ton of explosives hidden beneath the road killed the one man who had come closer than anyone else in history to destroying the Sicilian Mafia. A judge named Giovanni Falcone, whose work had put 338 of its members in prison, and whose murder was the Mafia's attempt to undo everything he had built. Case 7. Giovanni Falcone, May 23, 1992. Giovanni Falcone was born on May 18, 1939, in the La Calza neighborhood of Palermo, Sicily. It was a poor district where the Mafia's presence was ordinary, a background noise to daily life that most people accepted as simply part of how things worked. His childhood friend, Paolo Borsellino, grew up on the same streets. Both men studied law at the University of Palermo, became magistrates, and spent the rest of their lives trying to destroy the organization that had defined the neighborhood they came from. Both were killed in 1992, 57 days apart. Falcone joined the investigative branch of Palermo's prosecution office in 1980 at a particularly dangerous moment. The judge who was meant to lead the office, Cesare Terranova, had been assassinated in September 1979. The policeman investigating heroin trafficking, Boris Giuliano, had been killed in July 1979. Emanuele Basile, the carabinieri captain who took over the heroin investigation, was killed in May 1980. The judge who signed the arrest warrants Basile's investigation produced, Gaetano Costa, was murdered in August 1980.
Falcone was given bodyguards the day after Costa's killing.
He was 41 years old. What Falcone understood, and what the Sicilian Mafia had successfully prevented authorities from understanding for over a century, was that Cosa Nostra was a single organization with a defined structure, a governing commission, and clear chains of command. Every previous investigator had approached it as a collection of separate criminal clans. Falcone approached it as a corporation. He seized bank records. He followed the money. He traced the heroin network connecting Palermo to the Gambino family in New York. He built evidence the old way, document by document, and shared everything with his colleagues in an informal group that became known as the Anti-Mafia Pool. Falcone, Borsellino, and 2 other magistrates who signed every order collectively so no single person became the sole target. The keystone came in 1984 when Tommaso Buscetta, a senior Sicilian mafioso arrested in Brazil and facing extradition, agreed to cooperate. Buscetta spent 45 days with Falcone and gave him everything: the structure of the commission, the initiation rituals, the internal hierarchy, the names. He was the first high-ranking member of Cosa Nostra to break omerta, the code of silence, and his testimony gave Falcone the framework to prosecute hundreds of people at once, rather than individually. The Maxi trial began on February 10, 1986, in a specially constructed bunker courtroom built alongside Palermo's Ucciardone prison. The courtroom could withstand a missile attack. 2 alternate judges had been appointed in case the presiding judge was killed before the trial ended. There were 475 defendants.
The charges included 120 murders, drug trafficking, extortion, and for the first time in Italian history, the crime of simply being a member of the Mafia. Over 22 months of hearings, Falcone and Borsellino presented what they had built. On December 16, 1987, the verdict came. 338 convictions. 19 bosses received life sentences. The remaining convicted received a combined total of 2,665 years in prison. It was, and remains, the largest criminal trial in world history. Cosa Nostra boss Salvatore Riina, convicted in absentia and handed 2 life sentences, did not panic. He understood the Italian appeals system well. Convictions had been overturned before at higher courts. A Supreme Court judge known as the sentence killer, Corrado Carnevale, had a documented pattern of dismantling major organized crime convictions on appeal. Riina waited. He had the mob's campaign of killings against officials paused while the appeal process played out. On January 30, 1992, the Italian Supreme Court confirmed the Maxi trial convictions. Carnevale had been removed from the case. The convictions stood. All 338. The 19 life sentences were permanent. Riina reacted within weeks. On March 12, 1992, Salvatore Lima, a Sicilian politician who had been expected to use his connections to influence the Supreme Court ruling, was shot dead. He had failed Riina and was killed for it. Then Riina turned to Falcone. The planning had already begun in late 1991. Giovanni Brusca, a senior Corleonesi killer who admitted he had personally murdered over 100 people, was assigned the job. Riina wanted it done in Sicily, on the highway Falcone used to travel between Palermo International Airport and his apartment in the city on his weekly visits from Rome, where he had been working since 1991. Brusca's team carried out surveillance. They ran test drives on the highway using flashbulbs to simulate detonating a bomb as a speeding car passed. They built an experimental concrete structure and destroyed it to verify the bomb would be powerful enough. On the evening of May 8th, they placed 13 metal barrels loaded with approximately 400 kilograms of explosives in a drainage culvert under the A29 motorway near the town of Capaci, outside Palermo. The barrels were set on a skateboard in the culvert, connected to a remote detonator. They waited. On May 23, 1992, at 5:56 p.m., Falcone's 3-car convoy left Palermo International Airport. He was driving the middle car himself, a white Fiat Croma, with his wife, Francesca Morvillo, also a magistrate, in the passenger seat. Brusca was positioned in a small outbuilding on a hill to the right of the highway, watching through binoculars. A spotter near the airport tracked the convoy by phone. When the cars reached Capaci, Brusca pressed the remote detonator. The explosion registered on local earthquake monitors. It opened a crater in the motorway and threw the lead escort car several hundred meters. The 3 officers inside it, Vito Schifani, Rocco Di Cillo, and Antonio Montinaro, were killed instantly. Falcone's car slammed into the crater. He and Francesca Morvillo were still alive when rescuers reached them, but died of their injuries in hospital within hours. Francesca Morvillo died first. Giovanni Falcone died that evening. He was 53 years old. Riina reportedly opened champagne. All regular Italian television programming was suspended. Parliament declared a day of national mourning. Thousands gathered in Palermo. At the funeral, Rosaria Costa, the widow of Officer Vito Schifani, stood before the congregation and publicly addressed the Mafia directly. She asked its members to repent. The words were broadcast across the country. 57 days later, on July 19, 1992, a car packed with approximately 100 kilograms of TNT exploded outside the apartment building of Borsellino's mother in Via D'Amelio, Palermo, as Borsellino arrived to visit her. He and 5 members of his escort were killed.
His red notebook, which he carried everywhere and in which he recorded every detail of his investigations, vanished from the wreckage. It has never been found. Rino was arrested on January 15, 1993, at a villa in Palermo after 24 years as a fugitive. He was convicted of ordering both murders and died in prison in 2017.
Giovanni Brusca, who detonated the Capazzi bomb, was sentenced to 26 years. He was released in 2021 after serving his sentence and cooperating with prosecutors, under Italian law that provides reduced sentences for informants. The Mafia reacted to his cooperation by abducting the 12-year-old son of one of the other Capazzi witnesses and holding the boy for 779 days before strangling him and dissolving his body in acid. The Capazzi bombing did not protect the Maxi trial's legacy. It destroyed any chance the Mafia had of reversing it. The Italian state's response to the 1992 murders resulted in a crackdown that imprisoned hundreds more. The convictions stood. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But what the Capazzi bombing was actually a response to had begun the year before, in the summer of 1991, in a small town in southern Italy, where a Supreme Court prosecutor was shot dead while on holiday. A man who had been assigned to defend those Maxi trial convictions at the country's highest court, and whose murder was the Mafia's first attempt to stop the verdicts before they became permanent. Case 8. Antonio Scopelliti, August 9, 1991. To understand why Antonio Scopelliti was murdered on a road in southern Italy on a summer afternoon in 1991, you have to understand the one legal mechanism that Cosa Nostra still had left after losing the Maxi trial. The Italian appeal system, at its highest level, ran through the Supreme Court of Cassation in Rome. After the Maxi trial's initial convictions in December 1987, defendants began filing appeals. During those years, the presiding judge of the Supreme Court's first criminal section was a man named Corrado Carnevale, who had earned a nickname across Italy, the Sentence Killer. Between 1985 and 1993, the section under his presidency overturned or remanded approximately 500 convictions. The grounds were almost always procedural: a missing rubber stamp, an improperly filed document, a technicality. The sentences of Mafia bosses convicted in case after case dissolved on Carnevale's desk. The Mafia had come to rely on him as their most effective legal instrument. Among the convictions he had previously helped overturn were those connected to the murder of Judge Rocco Cinici, the man who had created the anti-Mafia pool. Cosa Nostra was counting on Carnevale to do the same with the Maxi trial. The Mafia had a secondary plan working in parallel. They had an allied Sicilian politician named Salvatore Lima, who was close to Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, and who they believed could ensure that Carnevale was assigned as the reviewing judge for the Maxi trial's final Supreme Court hearing. If Carnevale got the case, the convictions would almost certainly be dismantled on technical grounds. 19 life sentences would evaporate. 338 convictions, totaling 2,665 years in prison, would be gone. Every boss would walk. But there was another obstacle to this plan. A prosecutor had to stand up in the Supreme Court and argue the government's side, to fight each of the defense's appeals, to defend the trial's evidence, to block Carnevale from finding the technicalities he needed. The man assigned to do that was Antonino Scopelliti. Scopelliti was born in Campo Calabro, Calabria, on January 20, 1935. He had entered the judiciary at 24 and built one of the most distinguished careers in Italian law. He had argued the government's case in the first Aldo Moro trial. He had prosecuted the Achille Lauro kidnapping case. He had handled the Piazza Fontana massacre prosecution and the Rapido 904 bombing trial. He was one of the most experienced and capable prosecutors at the Supreme Court, and in the weeks before his death, he had been informally assigned to represent the government against the Maxi trial appeals. His job was to stand between Carnevale and those convictions. Cosa Nostra's legal strategy had two moving parts. The first was having Carnevale positioned to overturn the convictions. The second was making sure there was no competent prosecutor there to stop him. Killing Scopoliti addressed the second part. The Sicilian Mafia did not carry out the murder themselves. They contracted it to the 'Ndrangheta, the Calabrian organized crime organization, which operates in the southern Italian region of Calabria, where Scopoliti was from, and where he was spending his summer holiday. Using an outside organization provided distance from the act and exploited the 'Ndrangheta's operational knowledge of the local terrain. On August 9, 1991, Scopoliti was 56 years old. He had spent the day at the seaside near the hamlet of Piale, a small community on the outskirts of Villa San Giovanni. In the afternoon, he got back into his BMW 318i and drove toward the village. At a bend in the road just before the straight stretch leading into Pile, two men on a motorcycle had positioned themselves alongside the road. As Scopoliti's car reached the curve, they fired twice with a 12-gauge rifle loaded with buckshot. Both shots hit him in the head. He died immediately. The car, without a driver, veered off the road and came to rest against an embankment. Officers who responded to the scene initially believed it was a road accident. The external examination of the body and the discovery of the gunshot wounds established otherwise. Scopoliti's murder created the situation Cosa Nostra needed. Without a prepared, experienced prosecutor to argue the government's case, the Supreme Court hearing was thrown into disorder. The Mafia's plan was that the case would be delayed long enough that pre-trial detention time limits for the convicted bosses would expire, legally forcing their release. Even without achieving that specific outcome, the removal of Scopoliti weakened the prosecution's position at the most critical legal moment in the entire history of the Maxi trial. What the Mafia did not anticipate was that Falcone, who had been working at the Ministry of Justice in Rome since 1991, had been documenting and fighting Carnevale's pattern of overturned convictions. Falcone compiled the data on Carnevale's rulings and used it to build the case that the judge should not be assigned the Maxi trial appeal. Under pressure from Falcone and Justice Minister Claudio Martelli, Carnevale was removed from the case and replaced with Judge Arnaldo Valente. On January 30, 1992, Valente's panel upheld the Maxi trial convictions, all 338. 19 life sentences confirmed. Scopoliti had been murdered to engineer a legal outcome that never happened. He died to prevent convictions that were upheld anyway. Two trials were subsequently held at the court of Reggio Calabria. One against Salvatore Rina and 13 members of the Sicilian Mafia Commission, and a second against Bernardo Provenzano and 9 other bosses. The murder has never been officially solved. A breakthrough came in 2018 when a Mafia informant named Maurizio Avola stated he had participated in the killing and allowed investigators to recover the rifle, buried in the garden of a small property in the province of Catania. Charges followed. Trials are ongoing. Scopoliti's daughter, Rosanna, who established a foundation in her father's name in 2007, said when the weapon was found that her father was the patrimony of the entire country, not just their family. The murder is still technically unsolved, in the sense that no final convictions have been handed down for it, despite investigations continuing for more than 3 decades. The next case reaches back before all of this, to the early 1980s in Sicily, when the Corleonese Mafia faction used a different tactic entirely to stop a man from testifying. Not by killing the witness himself, but by systematically murdering everyone he had ever loved, one by one, in front of the whole country, to show every other potential informant exactly what the price of talking would be. Case 9. The family of Tommaso Buscetta, Sicily, 1982 to 1984.
There is a version of this story where Tommaso Buscetta is the witness, but that is not quite right. Buscetta was the target. His family was the message. Buscetta was born on July 13, 1928, in the La Calza district of Palermo, the same impoverished neighborhood that produced Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. He was the youngest of 17 children. His father was a glazier.
By the time he was 17, he was involved with the Sicilian Mafia, and by the mid-1950s, he had become a full member of the Porta Nuova clan, dealing in cigarette smuggling and later heroin. He was by no measure a passive figure. He was a senior, experienced mafioso who had operated across Italy, Brazil, and the United States for decades. He was also, according to DEA investigators who later worked with him, the most important, the most wanted, and the most endangered witness in American criminal history. But in 1982, he had not yet testified against anyone. He was living in Brazil, in hiding, watching what was happening in Sicily from a distance. What was happening was a war. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a faction from the small rural town of Corleone, led by Salvatore Riina, was executing a systematic takeover of the entire Sicilian Mafia. Riina had spent years building alliances, then betraying them once they were no longer useful. The established Palermo bosses, including Buscetta's allies Stefano Bontade and Salvatore Inzerillo, were killed one by one. Hundreds of their associates and relatives died alongside them. The Second Mafia War, as it came to be called, was not a war between two equal sides. It was a slaughter by the Corleonesi of everyone who stood in their way. Between 1981 and 1984, at least 400 mafia killings took place in Palermo alone, and as many again across the rest of Sicily. Buscetta was in Brazil throughout most of this. He had fled to escape the violence and had no intention of returning. He was not talking to anyone. He had not approached Italian or American authorities. He was not a threat to Riina in any operational sense. But Riina was a man who understood that potential threats needed to be destroyed before they materialized. And a man as experienced as Buscetta, with as many contacts and as much knowledge, was always a potential threat. On September 11, 1982, Buscetta's two sons from his first wife, Benedetto and Antonio, disappeared in Palermo. Their bodies were never found. In Sicily, the term for a killing where the body vanishes is lupara bianca, white shotgun. The victims dissolve from the record entirely. Benedetto and Antonio Buscetta were 27 and 25 years old, respectively. They had been taken and killed because of who their father was. In the weeks that followed, the killing continued. Buscetta's brother Vincenzo was murdered. His son-in-law, Giuseppe Genova, was killed. His brother-in-law, Pietro, was killed. 4 of his nephews were killed: Domenico Buscetta, Benedetto Buscetta, Orazio D'Amico, and Antonio D'Amico. The killings happened in rapid succession, each one a further statement of what the Corleonesi were willing to do to a man who had not yet done anything to them. The traditional rules of the Sicilian Mafia had always held that family members of even enemy mafiosi were not legitimate targets. Women and children were protected by convention, if not by written law. The Corleonesi did not observe these conventions. Riina had been systematically dismantling every rule that limited his power to destroy people, and the massacre of Buscetta's family was one of the clearest demonstrations of that. Buscetta was in Brazil when he learned what was happening to his family. He had no way to stop it and no way to retaliate from that distance. He was arrested in Sao Paulo on October 23, 1983. He was extradited to Italy on June 28, 1984. On the flight back, or shortly after arriving, he obtained barbiturates and attempted to kill himself. He survived. After the suicide attempt failed, Buscetta asked to speak with Giovanni Falcone. He spent 45 days telling Falcone everything. He explained the structure of the Sicilian Mafia Commission,
the governing body that previous investigators had suspected existed but could never prove. He described the initiation rituals, the hierarchy, the internal rules, the chain of command, the relationship between the Sicilian families and the American families. He named names. He explained how orders were given and how decisions were made.
His testimony, which became known as the Buscetta theorem, gave Falcone the framework to understand Cosa Nostra as a single organization rather than a collection of separate criminal gangs. And that understanding was the foundation on which 475 indictments were built. Buscetta did not testify because he was offered a deal he could not refuse. He testified because the Mafia had murdered his 2 sons, his brother, his son-in-law, his brother-in-law, and 4 of his nephews, 12 family members in total, and had done it openly, deliberately, as a warning to anyone who might consider cooperation. It was intended to intimidate him into silence. Instead, it convinced him that the organization he had devoted his life to had become something he no longer recognized. He called them in court, standing before 475 defendants, a gang of bullies and murderers. At the Maxi trial in 1987, Buscetta sat in the witness stand and spoke for hours. The defendants raged. One mafioso later admitted to Buscetta that he had personally strangled his 2 sons. Buscetta told him he forgave him because he understood what it meant to be inside the Mafia. Whether that forgiveness was genuine is between Buscetta and whatever he believed in. What is documented is that he never stopped testifying. After the Maxi trial, he continued working with Italian authorities. After Falcone and Borsellino were killed in 1992, he gave further testimony to the Anti-Mafia Commission. He died of cancer in the United States on April 2, 2000, at the age of 71, buried in North Miami, Florida, under a false name. His widow and his surviving son Roberto lived for decades under assumed identities in fear of reprisal. Many of his relatives refused to appear on camera for documentary filmmakers. Roberto said he would not show his face because killing Tommaso Buscetta's son would be a perfect trophy for any mafioso wanting to send a message. The Corleonesi had killed Buscetta's family to prevent a testimony that they calculated would never come. The testimony came anyway. The 338 convictions stood, and the family massacre that was meant to be a warning became instead the reason a man decided that the only thing left worth doing was to tell everything he knew. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case steps back before any of this, to Chicago in 1946, where a man who had survived a drive-by shooting began talking to the FBI from his hospital bed and was poisoned with mercury by the mob before he could finish speaking. Case 10, James Reagan, 1946. Before the FBI. Before the Kefauver Committee. Before the Maxi trial. Before any of the cases in this video, there was a man sitting in a hospital bed in Chicago, telling federal investigators everything he knew about the people who had just tried to kill him, and being poisoned through his IV line before he could finish. James Matthew Reagan was born in 1880 and grew up in the rough Irish neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side. He came of age during the circulation wars of the 1910s, when newspaper publishers used gangs to muscle out competitors and force newsstands to carry their papers. Violence was a professional tool he understood from an early age. Over the following decades, he worked his way into the race wire business, the backbone of illegal gambling across America. Horse racing in the early 20th century generated staggering amounts of illegal betting. Every bookmaker in every city needed one thing above everything else: the results, fast. The moment a race ended at a track in New York or Kentucky or California, the results had to reach the bookie joints in Chicago, Detroit, Kansas City, and Miami within seconds. The bookies needed the odds, the scratches, the jockeys, the track conditions. And they needed all of it before bettors could exploit delays.
The legal Western Union wire was restricted by law from transmitting results until a race was declared official, which created a delay of several minutes. The illegal race wire services transmitted the moment a race ended. Without that wire, a bookmaker could not operate. By the early 1930s, Reagan was running day-to-day operations for the nationwide news service under Moses Annenberg, the national wire service that fed gambling results to bookies across the country. When Annenberg was forced out under federal income tax and antitrust pressure in 1939, Reagan took control and built his own operation, Continental Press. Within a few years, Continental had become the dominant racing wire in the nation, feeding results to thousands of bookie operations. It was, in practical terms, the central nervous system of illegal gambling across the United States. The Chicago outfit wanted it. Tony Accardo, Murray Humphreys, and Jake Guzik approached Reagan repeatedly through the early 1940s. They offered to buy him out. Reagan refused every time. He told friends he understood precisely how the mob worked, and that if he sold, there was no way they would let him live long enough to spend the money. So he held on. When the outfit tried to squeeze him out by setting up a competing service called Trans-American Publishing, run by Bugsy Siegel in California, charging bookies $100 a day, and by ordering their thousands of bookmakers to stop using Continental, Reagan kept operating. In April 1946, a Chicago bookie named Harry Richmond was shot dead outside his own home for switching back to Continental. An associate of Reagan's was shot in May. The outfit had stopped asking. Reagan understood what was coming. He made a decision that was extraordinary for someone in his world. In the spring of 1946, he contacted his friend Drew Pearson, a nationally syndicated newspaper columnist, and through Pearson, sent detailed information about the structure of organized crime in Chicago directly to U.S. Attorney General Tom Clark. Pearson arranged for the FBI to assign 12 agents to interview Reagan in Chicago. For weeks, Reagan sat with federal investigators and told them everything: the names, the operations, the reach, the corruption. Attorney General Clark later confirmed to Pearson that the information Reagan provided was verified and that it led to very high places. Names familiar to every Chicago household appeared in what Reagan said. He told Pearson about Accardo, Guzik, and Humphreys by name, and said publicly that if he was killed, they were the men responsible. He also said something else. He said that if they want you, they are going to get you. On June 24, 1946, Reagan was driving his car south on State Street in Chicago. At the intersection with Pershing Road, he stopped behind a gray sedan. 2 bodyguards were following him in a separate car. A vehicle pulled alongside him, and shotgun blasts tore through the car. Reagan was hit seriously in the arms and legs. His bodyguards arrived within seconds, found him badly wounded, and rushed him to Michael Reese Hospital. His blood was transfused 10 times during emergency surgery. He was placed under 24-hour police guard. From his hospital bed, Reagan continued talking. He signed an affidavit naming his attackers. He gave investigators additional details about the outfit's operations. He was the most forthcoming witness the federal government had inside organized crime in Chicago, and he was doing it openly, while the mob knew he was doing it, and while Cook County police officers stood outside his door. Weeks passed. Reagan appeared to be recovering. The gunshot wounds were healing. Then, without any injury to explain it, his kidneys began to fail. On August 8th, he underwent emergency kidney surgery. On August 15th, 1946, James Reagan died. His autopsy revealed mercury in his blood. Someone had accessed his hospital room and poisoned him while he was under police protection. It was widely believed that Tony Accardo had bribed a member of the hospital staff to administer the poison. The coroner ruled that he could not determine whether Reagan had died from his gunshot wounds or from the mercury, and declined to issue a murder charge on that basis. The affidavit Reagan had signed was in the custody of Cook County State Attorney William Toohey, who was unable to prosecute against those named in it. Jake Guzik and others were questioned. there were no arrests. There were no convictions. Continental Press passed out of the Reagan family's control within months. By May 1947, it had been restructured under new ownership with outfit connections. Transamerican, having accomplished its purpose, announced it was closing in June 1947. The outfit now controlled the national racing wire, and with it, the financial infrastructure of illegal gambling across the United States. The Kefauver Committee, which arrived in Chicago 4 years later to investigate organized crime, the same committee that William Drury was shot dead before he could testify to, named Continental Press as public enemy number 1.
One member of Congress summed up what had happened to James Reagan in 5 words. After his death, the mob took over, and that was that. Reagan's murder remains officially unsolved. It has been on the list of Chicago's unsolved gangland killings since 1946, and it will stay there. The man who knew where all the money came from and who it went to was poisoned in a guarded hospital room, and the coroner who received the autopsy results could not find a way to call it murder. That is where this story ends. Not with a courtroom verdict, not with a life sentence, but with a man dying from the inside out in a bed surrounded by police officers who never suspected a thing, while the people he had named walked back to their offices and kept running Chicago exactly as they always had. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.